This isn't a tall tale whispered over a dying campfire, nor a dime novel fantasy sold back east. This is a story etched into the hard-packed soil of the Arizona Territory, a story of blood gold and a bond forged in the crucible of survival. It's the story of Jacob Sterling, a man running from his past, who stumbled upon a dying Apache woman and found his destiny. He saved her life, a simple act of mercy in a merciless land. But to her people, that act bound their spirits together forever, naming him her sacred husband, a title he never wanted, and a fate he would have to fight a war to truly understand. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Dragoon Mountains, beating the very moisture from the air and baking the granite outcrops until they shimmered with heat. Jacob Sterling felt it through the worn leather of his boots, a deep, persistent warmth that promised no relief. For 3 weeks, his only companions had been his stubborn mule Penelope, and the tantalizing glint of pyrite in his pan-fool's gold, a constant mockery from the earth. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy. The army had burned that out of him long ago, replacing it with a pragmatism as hard as the land he now worked. After the war, after seeing what men did to each other for flags and ideals, the solitary search for gold felt clean. The mountains didn't lie. They either gave up their treasure or they didn't. There was no malice in it. He was working a narrow, sun-drenched canyon when he first heard it. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a lizard. It was a human sound, a pained exhalation so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind whistling through the ocotillo cactus. He froze his hand, resting on the smooth walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Solitude in this territory was a blessing, but it was rarely guaranteed. Apache's bandits, or worse, other prospectors, could be over any rise. Slowly, quietly, he tethered Penelope to a scrubby mesquite and unslung his Winchester 73. Every instinct screamed at him to mount up and ride the other way. Trouble had a way of sticking to him like mud. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a soft moan that spoke of profound suffering. The part of him he thought the army had killed, the part that once believed in duty and decency stirred. He moved low and fast, using the boulders for cover. He rounded a large granite slab, and the scene unfolded before him, stark and brutal. A woman lay crumpled at the base of the rock, her dark hair fanned out against the pale dirt. She was Apache, dressed in a simple doeskin dress, now torn and stained dark with blood. A deep gash ran along her temple, and an arrow crudely made, not Apache style, protruded from her shoulder. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. A few yards away, a burly man with a greasy beard and sweat-stained shirt was rifling through a leather pouch, cursing under his breath. His horse, a mean-looking pinto, stood nearby. It was clear what had happened. An ambush, a robbery, and it wasn't over. The man kicked the pouch away in frustration and turned back towards the woman, his eyes filled with a cruel light. "Got nothing on you, do you?" He snarled more to himself than to her. "Well, can't leave a witness." He drew a long, wicked-looking knife. Jacob didn't think. He acted. "Drop it." Jacob's voice was a low growl, as steady as the rifle he leveled at the man's chest. The man whirled around his face, a mask of surprise that quickly curdled into a belligerent sneer. "Well, now look what the cat dragged in. This ain't your business, friend. Ride on." "I'm making it my business," Jacob said, his eyes cold. "Step away from her." The man whose name Jacob would later learn was Wade chuckled darkly. "She's just an Injun. What's it to you? You want her? You can have what's left when I'm through." A cold rage and emotion Jacob hadn't felt in years settled over him. He knew men like Wade. They were the scavengers of the frontier, preying on the weak, their cruelty, a stand-in for courage. "I won't say it again," Jacob warned. Wade decided to gamble. With a guttural yell, he lunged not at Jacob, but toward the woman, intending to finish his work. He reasoned Jacob wouldn't shoot for fear of hitting her. He reasoned wrong. The Winchester bucked against Jacob's shoulder. The shot was precise, not meant to kill, but to incapacitate. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Wade's thigh. He screamed a high, piercing sound and collapsed, clutching his leg as blood pumped between his fingers. His knife skittered across the rocks. Jacob closed the distance in 3 long strides, kicking the knife away and pressing the muzzle of the rifle against Wade's sweaty forehead. The man's eyes were wide with terror, now the bravado gone. "Who are you working for?" Jacob demanded. Wade just babbled a stream of curses and pleas. "Just a squaw. Found her alone." "Liar," Jacob said, pressing the rifle harder. "That arrow isn't yours. Who were you with?" Panic gave Wade a burst of strength. He thrashed wildly, kicking out with his good leg and knocking Jacob off balance for a split second. It was all he needed. He scrambled crab-like toward his pinto, hauled his bleeding body into the saddle, and spurred the animal into a frantic gallop out of the canyon, leaving a trail of blood on the sand. Jacob let him go. The woman was the priority. He knelt beside her, his medical training from the army rudimentary as it was kicking in. She was unconscious, her skin feverish to the touch. The arrow in her shoulder was the most immediate danger. Snapping off the shaft was easy, but the head was buried deep. Getting it out here would be impossible and would likely kill her. The head wound was also serious. He looked around. Her horse was gone, likely taken by Wade's accomplice. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her to the nearest town, Redemption Gulch, was just as bad. They'd either let her die in the street or lock her up. There was only one choice. With a grunt, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but her life felt immensely heavy. He carried her back to Penelope, draping her as gently as he could across the saddle. He then mounted behind her, holding her steady, and urged the mule back toward his hidden camp, a small, dilapidated line cabin he'd repaired, nestled in a box canyon a few miles away. For the next 3 days, Jacob worked tirelessly. He used a heated knife to lance the wound around the arrowhead, cleaning it with the last of his whiskey. He drew out the metal head in a single gut-wrenching pull while she was delirious with fever, a move that nearly stopped her heart. He stitched the wound shut with a needle and thread from his sewing kit. He constantly bathed her forehead with cool water from his canteen, forcing sips between her cracked lips. She drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words in a language he didn't understand. In her delirium, her hands would sometimes flail her eyes wide, with a terror that saw not him, but the face of her attacker. In those moments, he would speak to her in a low, calming voice, the way he would gentle a spooked horse. "Easy now. You're safe. You're safe." On the 4th day, the fever broke. He was sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle, when he heard a soft rustle from the cot. He looked over. She was awake, and her eyes were clear. They were the color of dark, polished obsidian, and they watched him with an unnerving intensity, a mixture of fear, confusion, and a deep, penetrating intelligence. She said nothing, merely tracked his every movement. He put down his rifle and held up his hands in a universal gesture of peace. "My name is Jacob," he said, slowly pointing to his chest. "You are hurt. I found you." She remained silent, her gaze unwavering. He ladled some thin broth from the pot over the fire into a tin cup and approached her slowly. He held it out. She stared at it for a long moment before her eyes flicked back to his face, searching for something. Finally, with a wince of pain, she pushed herself up on one elbow and took the cup. Her hands were steady. She drank, never taking her eyes off him. When she was done, she handed the cup back. "Nalin," she said, her voice raspy but clear. She touched her own chest. "Nalin," he repeated. It was a pretty name. A fragile truce settled over the small cabin. For the next week they lived in a world of gestures and single words. He would hunt, and she would watch him skin the rabbits. She took over the cooking, adding wild herbs she found near the cabin that made his bland fare taste remarkable. She mended the tear in his shirt with a skill that amazed him, and he would clean and redress her wounds, his touch professional and detached, though he was increasingly aware of the woman herself, of her quiet strength and the profound gratitude that shone in her eyes. He knew he had to take her back to her people. The Chiricahua. Their lands were to the south, a journey of 2, maybe 3 days. He was delaying, telling himself it was because she needed to regain her strength. But the truth was more complicated. In the quiet solitude of the canyon with this silent, graceful woman, he had found a strange peace. It was a dangerous peace, one that couldn't possibly last. One evening, she was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She had been quiet all day, a thoughtful, somber mood about her. "You go," she asked, her voice soft. Jacob looked up from the harness he was mending. "I have to take you home, Nalin. To your family." She nodded, then looked at him, her dark eyes seeming to pierce right through him. "My life," she said, touching her chest again. "It is yours." He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "No, your life is your own. I just helped out." She didn't smile back. Her expression was deadly serious. She said something in her own tongue, a phrase spoken with the weight of a sacred vow. He didn't understand the words, but he felt their power. He felt the air in the cabin shift as if a contract had been sealed, a line crossed that he couldn't see. He just nodded, feeling an unease he couldn't name. "Get some rest. We'll leave at sunrise." He didn't know then that he wasn't just returning a woman to her tribe. He was walking into a fate he had unknowingly sealed the moment he pulled her from the jaws of death. The journey south was a silent one, but the silence was thick with unspoken thoughts. Jacob rode his horse a sturdy bay he'd bought in Redemption Gulch, while Nalin sat gracefully atop Penelope, looking as natural on the mule as if she were born to it. She navigated by instinct, pointing the way through winding canyons and across sun-blasted mesas, with an unerring sense of direction. Jacob, for his part, felt a growing sense of trepidation. He was a white man, an intruder, willingly walking into the heart of the Apache. He had expected to be met with arrows or war cries. Instead, their arrival was almost anticlimactic. 2 Apache sentinels, seemingly appearing from the rocks themselves, intercepted them at the mouth of a wide wooded valley. They were lean, hard-faced men, their eyes missing nothing. They carried bows and rifles with equal ease. Nalin spoke to them in their rapid, flowing tongue. Their stoic expressions broke first with shock as they looked at her healing wounds, then with a deep, unreadable curiosity as their gaze fell upon Jacob. One of the sentinels rode off at a gallop, while the other escorted them into the valley. The camp was larger than Jacob had imagined. It wasn't the chaotic assortment of hides he'd seen in army illustrations, but an orderly village of wickiups, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods by a clear running stream. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat and pine. As they entered, a hush fell over the place. Faces, young, old, male, female, turned to stare. They weren't hostile, not yet, but they were wary, their eyes following his every move. An older man, tall and straight-backed, despite his age, emerged from the largest wickiup. His face was a roadmap of lines and wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and commanded instant authority. He wore a simple leather vest and leggings, his long grey hair held back by a beaded band. This was clearly the chief. Nalin slid from the mule and ran to him, embracing him. "Father," she said the word universal in its relief. The chief, whom Jacob would come to know as Gochisa, held his daughter, his stern face softening with a love that needed no translation. He examined her wounds, his jaw tight with anger, then listened intently as she recounted her story. Her tale was punctuated by gestures pointing to her shoulder, her head, and then finally to Jacob. Every eye in the village turned to him. He sat tall in his saddle, his face impassive, his hand resting near but not on his colt. He felt like a fly trapped in amber. Gochis approached him. "You are the man, Jacob Sterling," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. He had learned the name from Nalin. "I am," Jacob replied simply. "You fought for my daughter. You mended her wounds. You brought her home. I did what any decent man would do," Jacob said, shrugging off the praise. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to get back to the anonymity of his gold pan. Gochis studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. "In your world, perhaps this is a simple thing. A debt is paid, with thanks, with horses, with silver. But you are not in your world. Here the spirits of the mountain and the sky watch. They see when one life is given back from the edge of the spirit world by another." A knot of unease tightened in Jacob's stomach. "I don't require any payment, Chief. Just knowing she's safe is enough. I'll be on my way." He made to turn his horse, but Gochise held up a hand. "It is not a matter of payment. It is a matter of law. Our law. The life debt bond." Several of the nearby warriors murmured, their expressions a mixture of awe and surprise. "I don't understand," Jacob said, though he was beginning to fear that he did, "when a life is saved so completely." Gochis explained, his voice taking on a formal ceremonial tone. "When a soul is pulled back from the darkness, the spirits declare that the two souls are now intertwined. The Saviour's spirit is now the guardian of the saved. Your path is now her path. Her safety is your honor. To our people, the man who saves a woman's life in such a way becomes her protector, her shield." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You are now Ishke-Ne to her. In your tongue, there is no perfect word. It means sacred guardian. It means sacred husband." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jacob stared at Gochise, then at Nalin, who was watching him with an intense, unreadable expression. The villagers were all looking at him, not with hostility, but with a kind of reverence. He felt the bars of a cage slamming shut around him. "Husband," he choked out the word tasting like ash. "Now hold on. I respect your ways, I do, but that's not possible. I'm a white man. She's Apache. I have my own life." A young, powerfully built warrior with a surly face and a fresh scar on his cheek stepped forward. "Our ways are not for you to question, white man," he snarled. "You have been given a great honor." "Taza, be silent," Gochise commanded, not even looking at the warrior. Taza fell back, but his eyes burned with hatred for Jacob. Gochise turned back to Jacob, his expression patient, as if explaining something to a child. "This is not about love or homes or children as your people see it. It is a spiritual bond. You are now responsible for her. You are part of this family, this tribe. To leave would be to dishonor her, to dishonor us, and to anger the spirits that bound you together. It would be a great shame upon her, a shame that would follow her for all her days." Jacob felt a surge of panic. This was insane. He had saved her out of common decency, and now he was being shackled to her for life. He looked at Nalin, hoping to see some protest in her eyes, some sign that this was as crazy to her as it was to him. But she just watched him, her face a calm mask. Was this what she had been trying to tell him in the cabin? My life is yours. You saved her from the jackal, Gochis continued. But the jackal was sent by the wolf, a rancher, Bartholomew Corrigan. He wants this land. He tries to provoke us to start a war so the soldiers will drive us out. The danger to Nalin is not over. The spirits knew this. They chose you to be her shield. The name Corrigan meant nothing to Jacob, but the plot was chillingly familiar. It was the same story played out across the entire frontier. I can't, Jacob said, his voice strained. I can't stay here. This is not my life. You have no choice, Gochise said, and the finality in his voice was absolute. The bond is made. You are Ishkai-ne. You will have a wiki-up near mine. You will be given food and whatever you need. You will be one of us, and you will protect my daughter. Jacob looked around at the ring of faces at the ancient mountains that enclosed the valley at Nalin's steady, waiting gaze. He was a prospector without a claim, a soldier without a country, a man without a home. He had stumbled into their world, and now they were telling him he could never leave. The freedom he had cherished above all else had been stripped away by a single act of kindness. He was trapped. More than trapped. He was a husband. Jacob's new life began in a cage, albeit a well-appointed one. The wiki-up they gave him was small but sturdy, smelling of fresh pine and willow branches. It stood a respectful distance from Gochise's dwelling, yet close enough that Nalin was always within sight. He was a prisoner with the illusion of freedom. He could walk the length of the valley hunt in the nearby hills and sit by the stream, but the moment he looked toward the pass that led to the outside world, he could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. The first few weeks were a torment of frustration and cultural whiplash. The Apache way of life was a world away from his own. They moved with a quiet purposefulness he found unnerving. There was no wasted motion, no idle chatter. Everything had a reason, a rhythm tied to the sun, the seasons and the needs of the tribe. His own brusque, solitary habits felt clumsy and loud in comparison. His most immediate antagonist was Taza, the fierce warrior who had challenged him on his first day. It was an open secret in the camp that Taza had hoped to marry Nalin himself. Now he saw Jacob not just as an outsider, but as the thief of his future. Taza missed no opportunity to mock him. He would scoff at Jacob's attempts to learn their language, sneering at his pronunciation. When Jacob hunted, Taza would follow, criticizing his tracking skills. The white man makes enough noise to scare the deer into the next territory, he would say in Apache, loud enough for all to hear. Jacob ignored him, channeling his anger into chopping wood or methodically cleaning his rifle. He knew that reacting would be a sign of weakness, the very thing Taza wanted. Nalin was his only bridge to this strange new world. She became his reluctant teacher. She never acknowledged the sacred husband title directly, and for that he was grateful. Their interactions were formal, defined by necessity. This, she would say, holding up a root is good for fever. This, pointing to a leaf, stops bleeding. She taught him words. Undi for the people. Gawam for wiki-up. Besh for metal, a word she used for his guns. He learned slowly, his tongue stumbling over the guttural clicks and soft vowels. But he listened. He watched. He began to see the world through her eyes, a world not of empty wilderness, but of a landscape alive with meaning, history, and spirits. A fragile, unspoken respect began to grow between them. He admired her resilience, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. She in turn seemed to appreciate that he never tried to force himself on her, that he respected the invisible line between their wiki-ups. He was her guardian, her protector, but he made no claims on her as a husband would. One afternoon, seeking a brief escape, Jacob rode to the edge of the valley, dismounting to stare out at the distant hazy plains. This was as far as he could go. "It is a hard thing to be tied when you were born to run," a voice said from behind him. He turned to see Nalin standing there. She had approached so silently he hadn't heard a thing. "Your people have a strange way of saying, 'Thank you,'" he said, his voice laced with a bitterness he couldn't hide. "It is not thanks," she said, her gaze fixed on the same horizon. "It is honor. My father told you. My life was leaving my body. You held it back. Our spirits are now tangled like the roots of the same tree. I don't believe in spirits, Nalin. I believe in what I can see and touch." "You saw me dying," she replied softly. "You touched my wounds and made them clean. You saw life return. Was that not the work of a spirit, your spirit?" He had no answer for that. "Taza hates me," he said, changing the subject. "Taza is proud," she corrected. "He sees only a white man. He does not see the man who sat by me for 3 days, who fought for me. He does not see the man who treats me with respect when our law gives him the right to treat me as property. He is blind. But others are not." Her words were a small comfort, a crack of light in his dark frustration. He was beginning to realize that this cage was not one of malice, but of deeply held belief. To them he had been chosen by a power higher than any chief. His only other connection to his old life was Gus, the grizzled, cantankerous owner of the trading post in Redemption Gulch. Once a month, under the watchful eye of an Apache escort, Jacob was allowed to ride to the town for supplies, coffee flour, ammunition. These trips were his lifeline. "Still playing house with the natives, Sterling?" Gus asked on his third visit, leaning over the counter, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey and chewing tobacco. "It's not a game, Gus," Jacob said, sliding a list across the polished wood. "Heard whispers," Gus said, his voice dropping. "Bartholomew Corrigan's been asking about a white man living with Gotchis's people. He ain't the type to ask out of friendly curiosity. Gotchis mentioned him, said he's after this land." "That's the Sunday version," Gus snorted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Corrigan ain't just a rancher. He's a monster. Came here 5 years ago with nothing. Now he owns half the valley, controls the water rights, and has the sheriff in his pocket. He's been trying to provoke the Chiricahua for years. Wants the army to come in and pacify them so he can claim their valley. Heard he's got a new right-hand man, a real piece of work named Wade." The name hit Jacob like a physical blow. Wade Greasy Beard mean Pinto. Gus squinted. "Sounds like him. Why?" "He's the one who attacked Nalin." Jacob said, his voice hard. Gus whistled low. "Well, hell, that complicates things. So Corrigan's boys ambush the chief's daughter, and you end up saving her. Corrigan must be fit to be tied. A white man, living with them, acting as their ally. That messes up his whole narrative about them being savages." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated move by Corrigan, one that had backfired spectacularly, and Jacob was now standing right in the middle of the smoldering feud. "He'll come for you, Jake," Gus said, his usual cynicism replaced by genuine concern. "Not just for being with them. He'll come for you because you're a witness. You can tie him and his man, Wade, directly to the attack on Nalin." Jacob's jaw tightened. He thought of Nalin teaching him how to find water, by watching the birds of Gochis's stern but fair leadership of the children who had finally stopped running from him and would now watch him with shy curiosity. They weren't just natives anymore. They were people. They were his people, according to their law. The gilded cage suddenly felt very different. It was no longer just about his lost freedom. It was about protecting the people who had, in their own strange way, taken him in. The bond he had resented now felt less like a chain and more like a post he had to defend. He gathered his supplies, his mind racing. "Thanks, Gus. You hear anything else, you get word to me." "Be careful, son," the old man called after him. "Corrigan plays for keeps." As Jacob rode back to the valley, the mountains no longer looked like prison walls. They looked like a fortress, and he was no longer a prisoner. He was a sentry on its walls. The uneasy peace was shattered a week later. It happened just after dawn, when the valley was still wrapped in a cool grey mist. The alarm came, not as a shout, but as the frantic, terrified neighing of horses. Jacob was out of his wickiup in an instant, Winchester in hand. Warriors were pouring from their dwellings, grabbing bows and rifles. Down by the stream where the tribe kept its precious herd of horses, chaos had erupted. A group of about a dozen riders, all white men, were storming the herd. They weren't trying to steal the animals, they were shooting them. The crack of their rifles echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of senseless slaughter. It was a vicious, cowardly attack, designed to cripple the tribe and sow terror. Jacob didn't wait for orders. He sprinted toward the stream, taking cover behind a thicket of willows. He saw Taza and a handful of other warriors engaging the attackers from the far side, their arrows flying true, but their rifles hopelessly outgunned. The attackers were sloppy, emboldened by their numbers. Jacob raised his Winchester, the buttstock firm against his shoulder. He wasn't aiming to kill. That would bring the army down on the tribe for sure. He aimed for hands, for rifles, for shoulders. The first shot sent a raider's rifle spinning from his grasp. The second punched through another man's bicep, making him howl and drop his reins. His disciplined rapid fire had an immediate effect. The raiders, expecting only arrows and a few old muskets, were stunned by the accuracy and speed of the repeating rifle. They began to fall back, their attack faltering. From the corner of his eye, Jacob saw a movement near the wickiups. It was Narlin. She wasn't cowering. She held a bow, and beside her, 2 other women were nocking arrows, ready to defend their homes. Her face was calm and focused, a warrior queen defending her people. A fierce surge of protectiveness washed over him. He was her guardian, and he would not fail. He shifted his position, flanking the attackers, forcing them to divide their attention. One of the raiders, a big man on a familiar-looking pinto, spotted him. It was Wade. His leg was healed, but his face was twisted in a mask of hate and recognition. "It's him!" Wade roared to the others. "The prospector! Kill him!" Wade and 2 other men broke off from the main group and charged directly at Jacob's position. Bullets ripped through the willows around him, showering him with splintered wood. He dropped to one knee, firing deliberately. The first shot took one of the charging horses in the chest, sending it and its rider tumbling in a heap. The second caught the other man in the leg, knocking him from his saddle. Now it was just Wade. He galloped closer, firing his pistol wildly. Jacob held his fire, waiting, letting him come. The world narrowed to the space between them. At 50 yards, Wade raised his pistol for a final, careful shot. In that same instant, an arrow hissed through the air and embedded itself deep in Wade's gun arm. He screamed, dropping the pistol his arm rendered useless. Jacob looked back. The arrow had come from Narlin. Her expression was grim, her aim perfect. The fight was over. Seeing their leader wounded and their attack broken, the remaining raiders scooped up their injured comrades and fled the valley, leaving behind the bodies of 6 horses, bleeding into the stream. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the groans of the injured rider and the heartbroken sounds from the Apache men who were tending to their dead animals. Jacob walked out from the willows, his rifle held loosely at his side. The warriors, including Taza, stared at him with a new expression. The scorn was gone, replaced by a grudging, undeniable respect. He hadn't just fought. He had fought with skill and discipline, saving lives and turning the tide. Gochise approached his face like carved stone. He surveyed the damage, his eyes lingering on the dead horses. Then he looked at Jacob. "You have proven the spirits wise, Jacob Sterling," he said, his voice heavy. "Today you were not a white man among us. You were a warrior of the ND." Taza came forward, stopping before Jacob. He looked at Jacob's rifle, then at the wounded raider on the ground, then at Jacob's face. He said nothing, but he gave a short, sharp nod. In the Apache world, it was the equivalent of a sworn oath of brotherhood. The feud between them was over. Later that day, as Jacob helped move the horse carcasses, Narlin approached him. "You fought with the heart of a mountain lion," she said. "You shoot pretty well yourself." He replied, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like months. "You saved my skin back there." "A wife protects her husband," she said simply, without a hint of irony. Then her expression grew serious. "The man on the Pinto, the one I shot, that was him, wasn't it? The one who left me to die?" Jacob nodded. "His name is Wade. He works for Corrigan." "Then this is not over," she said, her voice turning to ice. "Corrigan sent him once to kill me. He sent him again to kill our horses. He will not stop until we are gone, or he is dead." Jacob knew she was right. They had won the battle, but Corrigan would not stop. He was a cancer on this land, and defending against him wasn't enough. As long as Corrigan was in power, Narlin and her people would never be safe. The attack had clarified everything for him. He wasn't just Narlin's guardian by law, he was her protector by choice. The bond, once a burden, was now his purpose. He looked from the dead horses to the determined set of Narlin's jaw, and he made a decision. He couldn't hide in this valley forever fighting defensive battles. The fight had to be taken to the serpent himself. He couldn't ask the Apache to ride against a white man's ranch. That would be suicide, an invitation for the army to finish the job Corrigan had started. This was a fight he had to take on himself. It was a personal matter now. It had started with him and Wade in that canyon, and it had to end with him and Corrigan. He was no longer just a prospector caught in the middle. He was a shield, and it was time to stop blocking blows and start striking back. Bartholomew Corrigan's ranch was less a home and more a fortress. It sprawled across a wide basin known as Bitter Creek, controlling the only reliable water source for miles around. The main house was a formidable 2-story structure made of stone and thick timber, with narrow windows that looked more like rifle slits. It was a monument to greed and paranoia. Jacob knew that a frontal assault was suicide. He spent 2 days scouting the ranch from the surrounding hills, using the field glasses he'd kept from his army days. He watched the patrols, timed the changing of the guards, and mapped out every building, every corral, every shadow. He was no longer just a prospector. He was Lieutenant Sterling again, planning a campaign. His objective: remove Corrigan and Wade as a threat permanently, and find proof that would expose Corrigan's crimes to someone beyond the local corrupt sheriff. He planned to go alone, under the cover of a moonless night. He explained his plan to Gochise and Taza, making it clear this was his fight. "This is a white man's cancer," Jacob told them. "It needs a white man's knife to cut it out. If your warriors are found at his ranch, it will be called a massacre. The bluecoats will ride and everything will be lost." Gochisa listened, his ancient eyes seeing the truth in Jacob's words. The spirits chose you as her shield. A shield can also be a sword. Go. Taza and 10 warriors will wait at the edge of his land. If you do not return by sunrise, they will come not for vengeance, but for you. It was a profound show of trust, and it settled in Jacob's heart with a heavy warmth. The night he chose was black as pitch. Dressed in dark clothing, his face smeared with charcoal, he moved like a ghost through the sagebrush. He left his horse miles away, approaching the final stretch on foot. He carried his Winchester, his Colt, and a knife. He was a walking arsenal, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He slipped past the outer patrols with ease, his army training serving him well. He scaled a section of the stone wall around the main compound and dropped silently into the shadows of the blacksmith's shop. The main house was lit, and he could hear the faint sound of a piano and raucous laughter. They were celebrating their victory. His primary target was Corrigan's office. According to Gus, Corrigan was a meticulous record keeper, too arrogant to believe anyone would ever see his ledgers. Jacob moved from shadow to shadow, every nerve endings tingling. He reached the side of the house and found the office window just as he'd mapped it. It was dark. With the patience of a safecracker, he used the tip of his knife to slowly, carefully pry the latch open. He slid the window up an inch at a time, the sound lost in the revelry from the front parlor. He slipped inside. The office smelled of leather cigar smoke and money. A large oak desk dominated the room, and a massive safe was built into the stone wall behind it. He didn't have time for the safe. He went for the desk, pulling open the drawers. He found ledgers detailing cattle sales, water rights acquisitions, and payments to the sheriff. And then he found it a smaller, private journal. He flipped it open. Corrigan's spidery script detailed his systematic campaign against the Chiricahua. It mentioned hiring Wade, the plan to provoke an incident by attacking the chief's daughter, and his frustration that a stray prospector had interfered. It was everything he needed. But then he saw something else. On the last few pages, Corrigan wrote not of cattle or land, but of geology. He wrote of assay reports and survey maps. A chilling realization dawned on Jacob. Corrigan didn't want the Apache Valley just for water or grazing land. The journal confirmed it. A rich vein of silver, one of the purest strikes in the territory, ran directly beneath the tribe's sacred ground, the grove where they held their most important ceremonies. It was the same grove where Nalin had first taken him to explain the meaning of the life-debt bond. Corrigan's greed wasn't just vast, it was biblical. Suddenly the office door flew open. Bartholomew Corrigan stood there, a lamp held high in one hand, a derringer in the other. He was a big man, not fat, but thick with muscle, with a perfectly trimmed beard and cold, intelligent eyes. Behind him stood Wade, his arm in a sling, a triumphant, hateful sneer on his face. "I knew you'd come," Corrigan said, his voice, a calm, cultured baritone that was more menacing than any shout. "A man with a code is so predictable. Wade, it seems your failure had a silver lining after all. It drew the rat out of his hole." Jacob didn't move. He held the journal in his hand. "It's over, Corrigan. It's all in here." Corrigan chuckled. "A book, who do you think is going to read it? Sheriff Miller, who I pay a handsome salary. Perhaps a judge who is also a dear friend. No, Mr. Sterling. That book and you will simply disappear. A tragic accident, perhaps. A prospector who fell afoul of the savages he chose to live with." Wade stepped forward, pulling a large pistol with his good hand. "I owe you for this," he snarled, gesturing to his sling. Before anyone could move, a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. "Drop your guns, both of you." All three men turned. Narlin stood in the open window, an arrow nocked in her bow, the point aimed directly at Corrigan's heart. She was a vision of righteous fury, her eyes blazing. "Naylan, what are you doing here?" Jacob exclaimed, his carefully laid plan dissolving into chaos. A wife does not let her husband walk into the serpent's den alone. She said, her gaze never leaving Corrigan. Corrigan's eyes widened, a flicker of fear finally breaking through his arrogant composure. "The squaw. I have a name," Narlin said, her voice like chipping flint, "and you will not speak it." Wade, seeing his boss hesitate, saw his chance. He swung his pistol toward Narlin. "I'll kill the witch." It happened in a blur of motion. Jacob lunged not at Wade, but at the desk, shoving it with all his might. The heavy oak desk slammed into Wade, pinning him against the wall as his pistol discharged into the ceiling. At the exact same moment, Narlin released her arrow. It flew with breathtaking speed and buried itself in Corrigan's shoulder, precisely where the derringer was held. He screamed and dropped the small pistol, the lamp crashing to the floor and plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight from the window. Jacob drew his Colt. "It's over." But Corrigan was not a man to be taken easily. Roaring in pain and rage, he ripped the arrow from his own shoulder and charged blindly into the darkness toward Jacob. The two men crashed together, falling to the floor in a desperate, brutal struggle. Corrigan was like a wounded bear, all fury and strength. Jacob fought with cold precision, trying to get a clear shot without hitting Narlin, who was now a shadow near the window. He heard Wade groan and struggle to get free. He had seconds. He slammed the butt of his Colt into Corrigan's temple. The big man grunted, his grip loosening for a moment. It was the opening Jacob needed. He twisted, brought the barrel of the Colt up under Corrigan's chin, and fired. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was deafening. Silence. Jacob pushed the heavy body off him and scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. He turned toward the desk. Wade had managed to free himself and was raising his pistol again, his face a mask of desperation. Twang! A second arrow sprouted from Wade's chest. He looked down at it in stupid surprise, then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in a heap, dead before he hit the floor. Jacob looked at Narlin. She stood bow, lowered her chest, rising and falling rapidly. She had just killed 2 men to save him. The debt between them had been paid in both directions, sealed in blood and gunpowder. He grabbed the journal from the floor. "We have to go. Now." He took her hand, and they slipped back out of the window, melting into the night, just as shouts and running footsteps echoed from inside the house. They rode hard through the remainder of the night, meeting Taza and the other warriors at the rendezvous point. There were no words, only a grim understanding, as Taza looked from their strained faces back towards the faint lights of the Corrigan ranch. He took the journal from Jacob and tucked it securely in his saddlebag. They rode back to the valley in silence, the rising sun casting long purple shadows behind them. The news of Corrigan's death spread through the Arizona territory like wildfire. The official story spun by a panicked Sheriff Miller was that Corrigan and his foreman Wade had been killed in a tragic gun-cleaning accident. But Gus, armed with anonymous information, courtesy of Taza, made sure the real story, the story from Corrigan's journal, found its way to a territorial marshal with a reputation for honesty. With Corrigan's empire crumbling and his crimes exposed, the systematic pressure on the Chiricahua ceased. The serpent had been beheaded. A week after the raid, Jacob stood before Gochise on the bluff overlooking the valley. The air was clean, the sun was warm, and a sense of peace had settled over the land. Narlin stood beside her father, her expression calm and unreadable. "The threat is gone," Gochise said, his gaze distant. "You have fulfilled the spirit of the life debt bond. You did not simply guard my daughter's life. You secured the life of our people. The spirits are pleased. Your honor is higher than any mountain." He paused, then turned his penetrating gaze on Jacob. "The bond is fulfilled. The debt is paid. You are free to go, Jacob Sterling. You may take your horse, your guns, and the finest mule from our herd. You will leave with our blessing and our deepest gratitude. You are no longer bound to us or to her." This was it. The moment Jacob had dreamed of for months. The cage door was open. He could ride out of this valley and never look back. He could return to his search for gold, to the solitary freedom he had craved. He could be Jacob Sterling, prospector again. He looked out at the vast expanse of the territory, the life he thought he wanted. Then he looked at Nalin. He saw her not as a responsibility or a symbol of his captivity, but as the woman who had taught him the names of the stars in her own language, who had shown him strength in stillness, who had faced down armed men to save his life. He thought of their silent companionship, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. To leave her now felt less like freedom and more like tearing out a part of himself. The life he'd had before felt empty, now a lonely search for yellow metal in a desolate land. Here in this valley he had found something far more valuable. He had found purpose. He had found honor. He had found a home. He turned back to Gochise, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "Thank you, Chief," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But I am not leaving." He then turned to Nalin, and for the first time he spoke to her not as a guardian or a stranger, but as a man. "Nalin," he said, meeting her gaze, "your law called me your sacred husband because I saved your life. I would like to stay, not because of any law or any debt, but because I believe my life truly began the day I found you. I want to be your husband, not because the spirits demand it, but because I choose it." A slow, beautiful smile transformed Nalin's face, a radiant expression of pure joy that he had never seen before. The unreadable mask was gone, and in its place was the woman she truly was. "I have been your wife by law, Jacob Sterling," she said, her voice soft but strong. "Now I will be your wife by choice." She stepped forward and took his hand. It was not a gesture of debt or obligation, but of partnership. Gochise watched them, a rare smile touching his own weathered face, and nodded once, a gesture of profound approval. Standing on that bluff with Nalin's hand in his Jacob Sterling was no longer a prisoner. He was the freest man he had ever been bound, not by a sacred law he hadn't understood, but by a love he had finally found. He had come to the mountains seeking gold, and instead had discovered the entire world. Jacob Sterling's story teaches us that sometimes the greatest freedom isn't found in riding away, but in finding a reason to stay. He was a man caught between two worlds, bound by a sacred Apache law he never asked for. Yet in that perceived cage, he discovered a purpose deeper than any gold vein, and a love more precious than any treasure. He saved Nalin's life, and in turn she her people, and the life they offered saved him from a lonely existence. Theirs is a testament to the fact that honor, courage, and love speak a language that transcends all boundaries. If this story of raw courage and unexpected destiny resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales from the untamed heart of the Old West. And most importantly, Subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life stories of the frontier.